So, the main stage for today, we're going to get into one of the most important topics that's emerging right now in philanthropy, and that's about the financial resources in the sector. The discussion is about the movement toward reparation focused funding, a topic that was not commonplace in the traditionally white led power structures of our sector just a decade ago. On the panel, we have an activist scholar who comes from a tradition of pushing for reparations focused framework to funding, a powerful author who supports new notions of seeing the healing power of money and wealth, and a Minnesota based foundation leader who is putting money behind this new framework. So, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce a friend and our moderator, Edgar Villanueva, an award winning author, activist, expert on issues of race and wealth and philanthropy, and the principle of decolonizing wealth project and liberated capital. Edgar, great to see you. Thank you for moderating, and over to you.
Thank you, Dan, so much. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. And just thank you for being here. I'm thrilled to facilitate this Upswell main stage conversation on reparations and how this approach can fundamentally change the way we do philanthropy and restore what was taken from Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color in the United States. Before we dive in, I'd like to provide a little background to help frame today's discussion. While I'll invite everyone joining us today to introduce yourself in the chat. The concept of reparations is big and complex, but understanding the history of wealth and racism will help us move forward and create new equitable systems to ensure everyone can thrive in their cultures and communities. The oppression of Black and Indigenous people has been embedded in America's economic, political, educational, and other institutions dating back before colonial times. In my book, Decolonizing Wealth, I write that poverty is the product of public policy and theft, facilitated by white supremacy. These intentional policies have created large-scale racial disparities and wealth gaps. For centuries, money has been used to divide and control us. But what if we use money as medicine and as a tool of love and healing from the effects of slavery and colonization? By distributing money using a reparations model, we can provide acknowledgement while creating new cycles of prosperity that trust and supports the leadership of those most impacted by historical and systemic racism. Only by disrupting and rethinking the system and shifting from charity to redistribution can we build an Indigenous and Black-led philanthropic infrastructure. Today, I am joined by two experts who will talk with me about models of reparative-focused funds, share their experiences, and talk about how they have specifically used reparations as part of their work. It's my pleasure to introduce my guest, Jen Reedy, who is the president of the Bush Foundation, which recently took on their biggest reparative venture yet, creating a $100 million fund to directly support wealth building for Black and Native communities in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 Native nations that surround them. Part of leading this endeavor, Jim believes the foundation's commitment is an effort to address racial wealth gaps that reflect the impacts of the taking of land, slavery, and other race-based policies throughout US history. Jen also serves on the boards of Independent Sector and the Council on Foundations. Janaé Bonsu is Brooklyn-born, Carolina-raised, an activist, scholar, and organizer. Janaé has spent her formative years in social policy research before joining the Chicago-based advocacy group Black Youth Project 100, or BYP 100, which advocated for a reparations framework for the city's Black community. She is currently the senior research associate at the National Black Women's Justice Institute, a research and policy organization dedicated to dismantling pathways to criminalization for Black women and girls. She describes herself as dedicated to an abolitionist praxis in service of a world that does not rely on policing, imprisonment, and the surveillance for safety and security. Janaé, welcome. I'm so excited to be in this conversation with you today.
Thanks, Edgar.
Hey,
Thanks so much.
Well,
Glad
thank
to be
you for
here.
being here. Thank you. Thanks for being here. And just to get us started here, I would love for you to just tell us a little bit more about your work and its relation to racial justice. Janaé, can I start with you?
Sure, yeah. So my work in racial justice has kind of coincided with my work in activism and in organizing. Specifically, both my activist work in scholarship, like you mentioned in my bio, is informed by both an abolitionist practice as well as what my political home, BYP 100, likes to call a Black queer feminist lens, both of which require consistently centering the most marginal and equally values the process of dismantling oppressive systems while building alternatives to them. So I got involved in this contemporary Black freedom movement, if you will, or the movement for Black lives more broadly back in 2014. And my work has kind of been at the nexus of racial, economic, and gender justice. As a survivor of multiple forms of violence myself, I'm particularly invested in transformative justice approaches to violence generally, and particularly gender violence. And for those who don't know, transformative justice is an approach to and processes for addressing harm that seeks to not only address the specific situation of harm in question, but to transform the conditions and social forces that made such harm possible. And one might just kind of glean how that is related to reparations generally. But yeah, my research and activism and organizing has all been kind of focused either directly or tangentially on the criminal legal system, as it has been a consistent site of and mechanism through which harm against Black people in particular are perpetrated and disproportionately perpetrated. So I've done a lot of work around police accountability, criminalization, and also separately labor organizing, in Fight for 15 and things like that. So yeah, my work around racial justice has kind of spilled into other areas as they're all really interconnected and has all kind of been really closely connected to my work in movement spaces.
Thank you for that, and thank you for breaking down the definition of transformative justice for folks today. Jen, would love to hear more about your work and its relation to racial justice.
Yes, so the Bush Foundation is a pretty traditional, independent foundation. The Bush Foundation, we say we're not beer, we're not beans, and we're not presidents. The Bush in the Bush Foundation is a guy named Archie Bush, who was one of the people who built 3M into a big, successful international corporation, and he left his money to the community in the form of the Bush Foundation. So we do quite a bit of work related to racial justice. We have a racial equity frame for all the things we do, but we do that because we believe it is the most important thing for us to be doing to fulfill the intent of Archie Bush to make the best possible use of the resources he left to the community. While we do a lot of work related to racial justice, I want to draw a distinction between everything we do that I'd say is intended to impact issues of racial justice and the things we are doing that we would consider reparative action, which to me is a particular sort of category or definition or spirit of action. And the reparative action that we are working on right now that has been mentioned in passing before is really inspired by the charge from Edgar's book. I mean, it's almost the literal, it's the literal interpretation of what was in Edgar's book, which was the suggestion that that all foundations tithe 10% of their assets to support, to give to Native and Black Americans for wealth building activities. And we have been working on how to do that. Our board voted to do that last summer. We issued social impact bonds. We have the $100 million, which is what that is for us. And just last week, actually, we got our expressions of interest from organizations to be the steward organizations to receive those dollars from us, and then distribute them. So that's where we are on that work.
Thank you, Jen. We're going to definitely unpack that work a little bit more, because I love how you just share so humbly. This is huge and significant for our sector, your leadership and the work that the foundation is doing in this space. So we're going to talk more about that. Janaé, I want to just hear a little bit more about how reparations specifically has been part of your work as an activist, scholar, and organizer. Let's break it down a little bit more.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's pretty known that, you know, reparations, the issue of reparations is certainly not new. There's been so many both individual and collective efforts, you know, before this contemporary moment to push for reparations. And within kind of grassroots movements for Black lives, we have been trying to operate in the tradition of reparations advocacy of our foremothers and forefathers. And so during my time as policy director of BYP 100, which is a national organization of young Black folks ages 18 to 35, so I co-authored BYP 100's public policy agendas. The agenda is to keep us safe and the agenda to build Black futures, respectively. And one of my tasks as policy director was to try to make policy in the impacts and utility of it kind of accessible and accessible to young Black folks. This is not really like, you know, a really sexy topic. You know, folks want to organize grassroots campaigns, but you know, really unpack, you know, the policy implications of the things that we want. And so the agenda to build Black futures was kind of our kind of hallmark economic justice platform that included reparations as like a primary grounding foundational element that kind of laid the ground for the other kind of transformative change that we felt that we needed to see in order to, as young Black folks, be able to live our lives in our full dignity and be able to thrive. Also during that time, I served as the leadership team of the Movement for Black Lives policy table, which produced the Vision for Black Lives platform, which is, I think, probably the most comprehensive policy platform to come out of any social movement, I would argue. And so both platforms talk about the generations of systemic harm that's been caused to Black people, and argue that the case for reparations is very clear, that reparations is not just a check. You know, we demanded an acknowledgement on the ways that government and corporations and other responsible institutions have harmed Black communities, from enslavement through mass incarceration. You know, one thing that we wanted to make very, very clear is that while the reparations conversation with regard to Black folks in particular in the United States stems from chattel slavery, but the vestiges and afterlife of slavery has taken so many different forms and continues on, like I said, through the criminal legal system, through redlining, through so many different policies and systems that have that continue to impact Black folks in the U.S. So we wanted to make that very clear. And so, you know, really kind of honing in on reparations as a commitment to fix that harm. And that, you know, we can't move forward without addressing the ways that past harms continue to impact the outcomes and opportunities of our communities and people. So, you know, taking those agendas and, you know, taking them to Capitol Hill to like have our lively days in which, we understood that even through, a conversation or a series of conversations with a, senator or other member of Congress or rep, that, they weren't going to just, pass HR 40, which has been, introduced every single year since 1989, only to die in committee. But to even just have those conversations with, members of Congress who deem the issue of reparations to be divisive or, unrealistic or what have you. It was really powerful for me to just have young Black people speak from the expertise of their experience about how reparations in different forms could impact our lives today and kind of interrupt intergenerational cycles of harm. So that's kind of been some of my work within the movement. I've also, written a lot about reparations in publications like In These Times and Dissent. And the other thing I want to uplift about reparations in terms of my work is that I was really honored to be a part of one of few successful campaigns for reparations in the U.S., and that was for reparations for police torture survivors in Chicago. And I hope I have time to just give some context for that fight, and try to keep it brief. But long story short, between 1971 and 1992, a Chicago police commander named John Burge and his detectives tortured over 120 Black men and women during interrogations using everything from suffocation to electric shock, Russian roulette, just kind of the whole nine. And John Burge, eventually after a 30-year struggle led by torture survivors, their mothers, other family and community members, along with organizers and lawyers, won Burge's termination from the Chicago Police Department, an official acknowledgement of a systemic practice of torture, and the exoneration of 21 Burge torture survivors. But there were still folks that were on death row from false confessions. There was still unfinished business. And so kind of fast forward to 2013, a good friend of mine, Joey Mogul, who's a movement lawyer in Chicago, drafted a reparations ordinance that was envisioned by all of those who were impacted. It kind of started as like a visioning activity of like, so what would it look like for us to be whole? Like what are the types of things that the city of Chicago could do to really atone for the decades of police torture that these folks have survived? And so, Mogul drafted that ordinance and submitted it to the city of Chicago. And in the spring of 2014 and thereafter, as the larger movement is kind of picked up after Ferguson, after, just as we know, movements have ebbs and flows. In 2014 to 2015, it was kind of a height of movement in the US, and kind of maximizing, I guess, off of that energy. Organizers like myself and so many others did weekly protests and actions, including like train takeovers, sing-ins, light actions, public rallies, banner drops, demonstrations at Chicago City Hall over about a 6-month period of time leading up to a mayoral and city council election. And we eventually secured the passage of the reparations legislation and the creation of a $5 million compensation fund. And so I think that the Chicago police torture survivor reparations ordinance is really a model legislation for the different elements of what I think reparations should include. With the exception of, according to the United Nations, cessation is a part of what reparations should include, so that it's, ending the act. And if you know anything about Chicago police, I think forms of torture still continue to happen. But in terms of restitution, compensation, and rehabilitation, those have all been included in the ordinance, and I think it sets a model for other city governments to follow. And so I'm just proud to have been a part of that.
No, thank you for sharing that model. I think it really helps for folks who might be new to this conversation to pick up on the tenets of what an example looks like, and also to know that this is not only something that has been demanded by a community for a long time. There is this new momentum, as you said, that's happening, and this new energy around reparations, and it is something that is possible. I believe we can see reparations in our lifetime. I really resonated with that comment of, we're not just talking about what happened hundreds of years ago. When we have these conversations about reparations and what we need to repair, we're talking about the accumulated disadvantages that have been imposed upon Black people in this country through the systems that continue to oppress and contribute to this race wealth gap that we have to atone for. The other thing that I picked up from a lot of folks ask, like, what is reparations? They want to kind of debate the meaning of it, reparations for who. And what I heard from your example is that reparations should actually be defined by the people who are impacted. The people who are harmed should be the ones to say, what do you want to be made whole? What do you need to be made whole, or at least to get into a spirit of repair for what has happened. In Indigenous communities, some folks don't use the word reparations or the language of reparations. It might be more about returning land back, but it's actually asking those folks who have historically been marginalized, oppressed, and harmed, what do they want to need in order to be, to see repair. And that's why I think reparations is such a beautiful word, because it really is about repairing. Jen, I want to switch to you, because we've had this example from movement, from community that is literally pushing on the government to pay reparations for state sanctioned or government sanctioned violence. Tell us more about the journey of Bush as a foundation to see the opportunity for you all as an institution to launch a reparative giving program, and how did you get there? How did you make this?
So there are a lot of different ways to answer that, because a lot of things came together for us to do this. And if it's okay, I'd love to answer it first kind of conceptually, like how did we get to the concept of reparative action, and then we can talk more about like how did the decision actually happen. But I think it's worth first just spending a second just making sure everyone in our conversation here today really has a sense of how profound wealth gaps are right now, like how significant this issue is that we're talking about. And the typical Black household in the US has 13 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by a typical white American household. That's a huge difference. And for Native American households, the figure is 8 cents for every dollar. And that's based on data that's really old, because Native American wealth has not actually been systematically measured since 2000. So I want to put a flashing footnote on that anything you are reading nationally about racial wealth gaps, Native Americans are usually not included, and just want to make sure that everyone's noting that and thinking about that as they're thinking about any work they might be doing related to wealth gaps. So wealth gaps are profound, and wealth gaps matter a lot because wealth matters a lot, right? So wealth gaps are about money, but they're about so much more. Wealth matters for for so much, way more than income, actually, that access to wealth helps people take advantage of opportunities like around education, around starting a business, around buying a house. But wealth also makes a really big difference in how families can navigate through financial difficulties or other hardships. So because of that, wealth is actually one of the most critical determinants of life opportunities and life outcomes in the US. So, I mean, you can tie wealth to everything, right? Wealth predicts educational achievement. Wealth predicts health. I mean, how long you live is tied to the wealth of the family that you were born into. And closing wealth gaps, therefore, can make a difference in addressing virtually all other social and economic disparities. So just want to make that case first of why wealth disparities, why wealth gaps matter. And then understanding the dynamics of wealth gaps. I mean, crucially, wealth, among other things, predicts wealth, right? So a child born into a wealthy family is more likely to be wealthy as an adult. And that's true because wealth's passed down, right, through inheritance, but it's also true because of the ways that wealthy families can more easily provide support and stability for children. So wealth is generational. It's the cycles of prosperity that Edgar was mentioning earlier. A family's wealth today is linked to the wealth of preceding generations. And for sure, individual initiative matters and luck matters, right? We all know people who are born into the same family and had very, very different life experiences. And it is still true. The data shows that your family's wealth matters a ton in your life opportunities and outcomes. And so the fact that wealth is generational is why the past discrimination and injustice still has so much impact today. Advantages and disadvantages can build across generations. It's that accumulated disadvantage that Edgar was talking about. And it makes it really hard for communities that have been harmed by past discrimination and injustice to catch up. Now, Black Americans and Native Americans have been disproportionately harmed by race-based policies, beginning with policies that supported slavery and land seizure. And Janaé, I think, did a really nice job laying out a lot of that sense of harm that has been created by race-based policies. I think it's also important to really emphasize the ways that throughout US history, policies that were really, really successful at building wealth, built wealth for white Americans and did not benefit Black and Native Americans in the same way. And if you don't know this policy history, I really encourage you spending time understanding it. One of the ones that really particularly blew me away was really deeply understanding the Homestead Act, which was way back in the 1860s. But the Homestead Act granted more than 270 million acres of land to private citizens, land that came from Native Americans. And so the act displaced Native Americans and gave the wealth overwhelmingly to white families. Today, the wealth of more than 46 million adults in the US can be traced back to the Homestead Act. If you look at all those policies that we lift up as successful US policy in building wealth, whether it's Social Security Act, whether it's the Housing Act and Federal Housing Authority, whether it's the GI Bill, all of these were very successful, were transformational in building wealth and creating opportunity for some, right? Which means they were also powerful forces in creating our current wealth gaps. So all of this is to say that to me, you can't understand wealth gaps in the US without understanding history. And it means you can't address wealth gaps in the US without strategies that acknowledge and counteract those historical impacts. So I think about the title of this session is, will reparations close the racial wealth gap? And I would flip that now to make the point that I truly believe we can't close the racial wealth gap without reparative action.
Right on. I definitely believe that and support that. So Jen, you said, Bush is a, quote, typical foundation, and you guys are supporting a couple states and several, I think about 23 Native nations, sort of in the Midwest. Could you just share a little bit about the journey to get to a decision to create a $100 million fund? Folks, I'm sure are always asking the question around, like, how did the board, the
Yeah,
leadership, how
yeah,
did kind of say yes to this big idea?
yeah. Well, the actual decision happened last summer at our August board retreat, and that was the first board meeting we'd had after George Floyd's murder. And the main topic of the retreat was, how do we think about racial justice in a different way? And we staff put together this presentation that laid out all the things we were doing related to racial equity in our work. And it was a lot. And it's stuff that we are proud of and have been proud of, work that we're doing that we think is important, and systems change work, and things we've have felt really good about. And, the board said, yeah, not enough. The board just said, look, it is clear that everything we are doing, everything everyone is doing is not enough, right? We're not doing enough to actually make the fundamental changes that we want to see in the country related to racial equity, and we have to do more. And so it was definitely a, think bigger, think differently moment for us. And we put out, a few ideas. And one of them was this idea of reparative action. And, I made the case similar to what I just shared, but also bringing in sort of what it means for us as a foundation, and what role we can play, and uniquely as the kind of institution we are, and given our wealth. And the board said yes. Now, you can't understand the conversation in that meeting without understanding the years of conversations that we'd had before to get us to that moment. And I think that's a big part of this. And it's both, I think about our board retreat 2 years ago. One of the major topics was actually understanding data on racial wealth gaps, and how history matters in racial issues today. In our board retreat the year before, we had actually done board debates on a bunch of big topics in philanthropy, like, should we spend down, or, like other big questions in philanthropy, where we divided the board and set up a debate. And one of the questions we debated was, should we adopt a reparations framework? So the board had talked about it conceptually before it was something that actually came before them as a particular idea. I also think that part of getting to something like this is getting comfortable as a group with doing things that are big in general, not just, related to reparations, but what kind of conversations do you have with the board about, what are the biggest things we can do? What's the most important action we can do? And also being really, really frank and honest about the critiques of philanthropy. Edgar, when your book came out, we gave it to folks, right? The worst things that people write about about us, we share with the board, to make sure that people are understanding. People have different perspectives about how philanthropy can run, in the ways that we have done things in the past, the way we're doing things now. It doesn't have to be that way. And what are other ways people are seeing us, or seeing possibilities for us, so that, I think it's created a sense of openness, and even excitement on the board about thinking about, how do we do things differently?
I love that. I mean, I know there's a lot of hard work that went behind and lots of conversations, but you all just had the conversation, at least have the conversation and create spaces for those debates,
Yeah.
and to learn and to acknowledge history. It's definitely a great place to start. Janaé, foundations like Bush are not the majority, which you probably know that. And just wondering, from a movement perspective and your research perspective, if you have thoughts on how we can push and encourage more institutions and philanthropy to take up this work? What will it take to kind of push philanthropy to give in a reparative or a reparations kind of framework from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And it's refreshing to hear about, the approach that the Bush Foundation has been taking. So thinking about philanthropy specifically, I think about it differently than when I think about reparations relative to, government institutions, in particular corporations, where there's a clear line to be drawn from that institution and the and harmful actions or complicit actions. And I think one thing that's important to name, even though I do believe that reparations should be defined by, and approaches to reparations should be defined by the injured or harmed parties. I do want to just name or outline the kind of 5 conditions that must be met for full reparations according to the UN. I think it's a really good framework. So the 5 conditions, first are cessation or assurances and guarantees of non-repetition, which basically means that, the party responsible for injuring or harming is under obligation to cease if the act is continuing, and to offer appropriate assurances and guarantees of non-repetition. The second is restitution and repatriation. So restitution meaning to establish the situation that existed before the wrongful act was committed. At compensation, which I think is pretty self-explanatory for any financially accessible damage suffered. The fourth is satisfaction, and that's the condition under which apology would fall under. A lot of folks talk about apology and acknowledgement of wrong cause, and that would be under the satisfaction condition. So satisfaction is like emotional injury to a reputation or what have you. And the fifth is rehabilitation, to include legal, medical, psychological, and or other care services. So that being said, thinking about philanthropy or a philanthropic approach to reparations, I think that the first maybe obvious step would be to examine your particular institution's relationship to harm. Although, maybe a foundation might not have been directly involved in the slave trade or directly, let's say investing in private prisons or some other kind of implication of harm, right? But how was that wealth accumulated of the foundation, right? Or like where it had to come from some, I would argue, extraction of labor or some type of there's harm somewhere where there's immense wealth, there is immense harm, I believe. So I think philanthropic institutions in particular should be tasked first and foremost with examining their history and their relationship to harm and marginalized communities. And I think being okay with letting, well, first putting your ear to the ground and letting go of capital without a contingency, like Jen, you mentioned like social impact bonds, for example, which I know a bit about just from I used to work at an organization called MDRC based in New York, and we evaluated what we believed was the first social impact bond in New York City, financed by Goldman Sachs. The details are not important, but I learned a lot about the structure of social impact bonds, and what I understand is that they're tied to they're like a pay for success model. And when I think about philanthropic dollars, if they're not tied to pay for success outcome. If they're tied to some type of grant report or some type of obligation for the receiving party. And I think that, you know, the idea of releasing capital for, you know, whether it's wealth building activities or to otherwise reduce disparities, I think is important without the expectation of receiving something back or receiving something in return. But by and large, I think that the onus of reparations from a large standpoint is not necessarily on, it's not necessarily on foundations per se. I think the type of transformative change that reparations implicates is going to require much more than philanthropic institutions, but also state governments, state, federal, local governments, and other institutional actors outside of philanthropy.
Yeah, thank you for Janaé for kind of breaking that down. I think I've been thinking about this lately, kind of like there's a big R reparations that is the responsibility of governments to follow the UN definition and to repair the harm that happened on their watch. I think philanthropy has an opportunity to support movement and fighting for that, right? I think that's one thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Two, I think that we can do exactly what Janaé said, is examine our own complicity, our own potential harm that has happened historically within our institutions. I think individuals, institutions, anyone can say, how have I harmed in the accumulation of my wealth? And maybe it was unintentional, right? Like Janaé said, maybe your foundation can't trace a dotted line back to wealth that was accumulated directly from slave labor. I've worked in an institution that could do that before. I worked in old tobacco money foundation. But regardless, to Jen's point earlier, right, that wealth begets wealth, and wealth has benefited from accumulated advantages that are baked into the system that people of color have not been able to benefit from in the same way. I think one of the big blocks to this is that it's easy to kind of dust our hands off and say, well, we weren't born when all these things happened historically. We weren't around. We can't take ownership. But we are all here now, and we have inherited this history that we must do something about. And so I think philanthropy has an amazing role to play as organizations that are literally about the love of mankind or the love of people in our communities to support movement for healing and repair, and to actually demonstrate leadership in how we use our resources that were accumulated in ways that were extractive when you begin to really look closely at that. I want to just share one quick thing that we're doing at Decolonizing Wealth Project. We've kind of used the framework, the reparative little r framework of reparations in our work and in our fund, Liberated Capital, which is a fund where donors and institutions give to us with no strings attached, and we redistribute that wealth under the advisement of Black and Indigenous people with no strings attached. And in doing that work and kind of supporting donors in sort of this journey of understanding the origins of wealth and their own family's history or institutional history, and the obligation that we hold to give that wealth back, we've been really successful in kind of moving more money back to communities. Earlier this year, we announced what I believe to be, somebody hit me up if I'm overstating this, but the first ever national reparations fund to support movement building, exactly what Janaé was talking about, to support grassroots organizations and advocating to institutions, to governments, to corporations for reparations that is in alignment with that UN definition. And so we are going to be announcing next month $1.5 million to organizations from all around the country who are on the ground doing that work and advocating for these campaigns. Black-led organizations and Native Indigenous organizations that are fighting for the return of land. And so we're really excited about that. And any funders who want to talk more about that work, we're happy to share more. Just reach out to me.
Edgar, I'd love to
Sounds
jump in
awesome.
and build
Yeah.
on what both of you were saying about sort of terminology and definitions, because we are really careful not to say that what we are doing is reparations, because I think those distinctions are really important, and we use the term reparative action. And we do that for a few reasons. One is not to dilute the concept of reparations, which does mean something very specific. And we don't want that to be confusing. And we don't want to suggest that the things we are doing are in place of reparations, which is something distinct. We also are careful because when we first started down this path, we spent a lot of time talking to leaders in the Native American community and Black community, and found really, people had really different reactions to the term, or to different terms related. And particularly, well, individuals had different opinions. We definitely saw differences in opinion in the Native community versus with the Black leaders we talked to, in terms of what that word means within the community, and preferences for words like restorative, or other ways of thinking about it. So we see a huge opportunity for action that is reparative for private actors, whether you're an individual or whether you're an institution. And that's what I would say our work falls into that category. And we want to be promoters and encouragers of private individuals, institutions, thinking about what reparative action could mean in their context, when there isn't necessarily a specific harm or a specific compensation that you're paying to individuals. But there's definitely a way in which, if you are a person of wealth, if you are an institution of wealth, you have benefited from systems, from an economy that has exploited, extracted labor, people, and a way to acknowledge and atone for that. I also do want to jump in, if it's okay, Janaé, on what you were describing with social impact bonds is totally a use of that term, and that is a way that social impact bonds are used, that pay for performance. That's not what we were talking about in our case. So what we actually, we bonded, so we borrowed money. So like the Bush Foundation owes people now this money, but we are just giving it away, like the fewest possible strings you could have. I mean, we're really thinking about it as money that we are handing over, and we are seeking organizations who will receive it and handle it on behalf of the communities they serve. But there's not a pay per performance kind of element in what we're doing. There's plenty of that throughout philanthropy, but that's not how I meant that term in the context of our work.
Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. That sounds awesome. And also just really appreciate the making the distinction between reparative action and kind of big R reparations. I think there's a lot of folks who talk about just like investment in disadvantaged communities as reparations, and just universal programs are great when they're not the same as reparations. The specificity of harm is really important. So just I appreciate that distinction.
I really agree with that. And I think even within private reparative action, there's some meaningful distinctions. Like I look at what Georgetown's doing, where they are able to actually identify particular individuals who were harmed. But then I look at something like South Dakota State has this initiative that I think is so cool called the Wokini Initiative, where they've just investigated generally where the money came from and understand the history of land grant universities and where was the land that they've been benefiting from, and then made a pledge to use the proceeds, the ongoing proceeds from the land that they got as an original land grant university, to support Native education at the school. And it's just, I think those are a couple examples, but we're seeing lots more examples, I think, of private institutions or non-governmental institutions thinking about, in our context, in our work, with our history, what is that action that we could be taking that's meaningful. And it's exciting. I feel like there are more examples every day.
Absolutely, I love those examples. And I want to say I see questions coming in, and I will try to incorporate some questions. If there are others that have questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A function. I'm just really excited about this conversation and the moment that we're in, because there has been a lot of advocacy for reparations, big R, federal reparations paid to descendants of Black slaves in this country. And we're in this moment that I feel we're so close that I can taste it, closer than we've ever been, with this new resurgence where we had almost every presidential candidate in this last election on the Democratic side say they were in support of reparations. We've had, social influencers and artists like Alicia Keys who are calling for Congress to pass reparations. We've seen many cities at the local level, from St. Paul to Portland to Providence, Rhode Island, Chicago, and in the case that Janaé shared, others, Evanston, Illinois recently, to pass a form of reparations locally in government. And so we are at this place where we're seeing a groundswell of support and acknowledgement that there is a debt that needs to be paid to repair what has been broken, the original sense of this country. Janaé, I just want to ask you, because you've been really working closely in social movements over the past couple of years, where do you see the newest opportunities? What's exciting you? Where should we be paying attention and supporting to really continue to scale these efforts to actually actualize reparations for Black people in this country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for reasons that you just said, I think legislation at the federal level, including the passage of HR 40 and its Senate component. The official title is to establish a commission to study reparation proposals for African Americans Act. I think the feasibility or plausibility of its passage in the in the next presidential term or what have you is higher than it's ever been. Just the fact that it actually has co-sponsors now, and people are actually talking. There's some movement, albeit slow, but much more than it has been over the past 30 years that it's been introduced. So that's exciting. I think that and this is more specific as reparations should be, but thinking about reparations for the devastating impacts of the war on drugs and criminalization specifically, I think that there's a lot of new opportunities that have opened up or are now opening up as more states continue to legalize marijuana, as decriminalization and legalization becomes more of a conversation at the state and local levels. I think that one of the reparations demand in the Movement for Black Lives platform is reparations for the war on drugs, including a reinvestment of the resulting savings and revenue into restorative services, mental health services, jobs programs, and other programs supported supporting those impacted by mass criminalization. Even in a state where I lived for a long time, Illinois, marijuana or cannabis is decriminalized and legalized actually and being regulated, but there are still many people who are incarcerated for those drug-related offenses. There are people who are still being criminalized in the Black market because they are actually locked out, whether it's because of the cost barriers or what have you, to actually get a license to, I
feel like I lost your volume, Janaé.
Oh,
there you are.
Oh no.
You're back.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for reparative action and big art reparations with regard to the war on drugs as the harm and the criminalization, resulting from that. And really quickly, just to go back to the Chicago case that I mentioned earlier, in terms of the outcomes, I mentioned the $5 million fund for survivors, but there are other outcomes from that ordinance that I think are important to name, and thinking about other opportunities for reparations in different areas. first and foremost, there was an official apology from the city of Chicago to living survivors. The ordinance required a creation of a public memorial. Chicago Public Schools curriculum is required to include a section of the torture survivors, the history of the torture, in their, I believe it's 8th grade curriculum. So, children are required to learn about what happened. So I mentioned the compensation, free enrollment in city colleges for torture survivors, their immediate family and grandchildren, priority access to city employment for torture survivors, and lastly, which I think is super important, the creation of a counseling and organizing center for survivors and all people affected by police violence in Chicago. It's called the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And that last piece, I think, is really important because, we can talk, a lot of conversation about reparations is about the compensation, writing the check. And don't get me wrong, I think Black folks, I think Indigenous folks in the United States in particular definitely need compensation. And, you could argue with me about that. But I think that the impact of intergenerational trauma and harm is so important, and a check cannot heal that. Healing is an integral part of what makes one whole, what makes a thing repaired, right? A harm repaired. And so, the Chicago Torture Justice Center is a place where that adopts a healing justice framework for not just the people who were, directly tortured by Burge and his crew, but all people affected by police violence in Chicago, which is still an ongoing harm, right? And so I think, that piece, like in my research, I just recently completed my doctoral studies and talked to many survivors of different forms of state violence, particularly police violence, and just asked them to vision, like, what does safety look like to you? What does it look like to you to be able to like live your life in your full dignity? And besides actually many participants talking about reparations for their police sexual violence and other things, talked about the importance of having healing spaces, like access to free and low cost mental health care, holistic practitioners, places to be able to process their trauma and move through that so that they don't pass that on to their children, and so on and so forth. And so I really think that, whatever it is that we're talking about, whatever harm that we're talking about, we can't lose sight of the component that will allow people to heal from the ongoing physical, mental, whatever form of trauma that has been enacted.
I'm about to jump out of my chair because I love where this conversation is going right now. I'm all about healing. And like Janaé said, don't get us wrong. The money matters, and we're talking about money at this conference today, and we're talking about philanthropy, and what we have is money. We have other things to offer the world. So compensation needs to be made. And I do think that money can be in itself a form of medicine. I'll talk about that. But this is also getting to some of the questions that are coming up where folks are asking, beyond the money, what else must we do to repair? And there's a question about, what can we learn from sort of reparation processes outside the US, like in Canada, Australia, South Africa, for example. Is there a role, or what is the role of philanthropy or other institutions to help get us to a place of the healing work that needs to happen that is also a necessary part of restoring balance and repairing? So any thoughts that you all may have about that? And then I might chime in on some thoughts of my own, because I love this subject too.
I think you should go first, Edgar. Lay it on us.
Well, I love that the apology, Janaé, in the case you mentioned in Chicago, the apology that happened, because there's so many folks that think that it's just about the money, and again, that is a critical piece of the equation, but it is also about the truth and the acknowledgement and the documenting of what has transpired. And it's not because we want to sit in these sad stories forever, but there's an active erasure of our history. Right now, we are, seeing this battle in this country to take out critical pieces of history out of the classroom. And this is absolutely a tactic of white supremacy to erase the past. And the thing is, we just have to rip that Band-Aid off and actually confront that history and deal with it and grieve that history. And we want to hear an apology. And this country is, one of the only countries that has had, chattel slavery in the way that we've had, and there's never been an official apology from Congress to Black people in this country for slavery. There's never been an official apology for all of the broken treaties to Indigenous people. And so I think we're not going to move forward as a country and see the racial healing that we all want until we actually go through some of those processes to not erase the history, not to ignore it, not to continue to sweep it under the carpet, but to actually step into that history and to officially apologize, because we want to be seen and heard. And we want, a commitment that these types of human rights and violence violations and racial terror are not going to occur again on the shores of this country. So to me, those components are really, really important. It's not perfect in Canada. I've talked to a lot, to a lot of folks up there, and funders have done a great job in Canada to align and to support recommendations that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. But there is at least at some level more of a collective awareness, and it feels like more of a collective commitment to repair there than what I've experienced working around the United States. So I do think we can learn from those processes and adopt various components. And there are folks working in this country to do that, and that's philanthropy could be supporting that work. There's a very first Truth and Healing Commission in the state of California that's happening right now. Most people don't know about it, but it's really the first statewide commission to kind of address the grievances of First Nations folks in the state of California, which is amazing and could lead to a federal process. But we've got to support, and we all have to be engaged in those processes. Jen, I'll toss it to you. You got anything to?
I think that was a great answer. I think, it is different thinking about what reconciliation means, what an apology means when you're talking in a public policy standpoint, you're talking about something that's national or statewide, or, then thinking about what it means at the, an individual institution level. I will say that we have our next board retreat coming up here in a few weeks, and one of our big learning topics is actually about trauma and healing, and what does it mean for philanthropy, and hearing from some efforts that we're funding that are trying to think about that very question about how do you integrate healing into philanthropic practices, and what can we learn from what's being done, and what can we embed more in our own work.
Thank you. Anything else you want to say about that, Janaé?
No, I mean, I think that you guys have done a good job in covering it. I guess the only thing I would add too is, in addition to what's already been said, I think something that philanthropy can do as well. So one of the reparations demands out of the movement for Black Lives is kind of like cultural reparations, if you will, for kind of the erasure of history and things like that that came up earlier in the conversation. I think one thing in particular is like funding historical sites commemorating Black history. Like one of the 412 National Parks Service sites in the U.S. Only 6% of those are specifically devoted to Black history. And according to the Institute of Museums and Library Service, only 35,000 museums in the U.S. There are 35,000 museums in the U.S., but only 300 or less than 1% of them are specifically devoted to Black individuals or history. And despite their valuable programming and exhibitions, these organizations don't receive adequate funding from philanthropic organizations or state legislatures. And so, you know, just like the myriad other things that we've mentioned in terms of where philanthropy can put their dollars, I think that's another thing too, that's kind of aligned with the set of things that you know, folks are calling for, and that is reparations for the cultural and educational exploitation, erasure, and extraction of our communities in the forms of you know, memorials and mandated public school curriculums that I mentioned earlier, and you know, things in that regard.
Yeah, thank you for that, Janaé. It's all like connected, right? Like all of these pieces are so connected. I wanna, we do have to close in just a few minutes here, but I'll squeeze in a couple more questions that I see coming through here in our last few minutes. Wanna ask, Jen, this is a question for you. If you have advice for nonprofit leaders who are listening about ways that they can work with their funders to change their approaches or practices in grant making.
So if I'm understanding the question, sort of, it seems like it's a broad question on how to engage with funders on changing practices related to anything really, or related to racial equity. And I would acknowledge that's a challenge. I appreciate that there are complicated power dynamics between a funder and a grantee. So I appreciate you know, why that's something that people really struggle with and think about how to have what can be challenging conversations. One bit of advice I would have is just making sure you're really engaging in your nonprofit associations and engaging with those organizations who can collectively say things to foundations that it may feel hard to, as an individual organization, say to a funder who, you know, worst case, finds you ungrateful and it affects future funding. But even in non-worst case, you know, you have people working at foundations who could take it personally and be defensive, and it can change a dynamic or make something awkward. So I think, you know, finding ways to have that conversation, test whether there's receptivity to that conversation, and saying, you know, are you open to talking about this, or, you know, are you okay with me sharing an experience I had, or, you know, and test, because you know, it's easy to say, like, tell funders what you think, and I understand that the stakes can be high on that, but I think do what you can to try and have that conversation to the extent you feel safe with individual funders. But then really, you know, if you can support those efforts where you get a collective nonprofit, collective community voice that can give the surveys or the, you know, the op-ed pieces or the ways to really have a louder collective voice pushing philanthropy to change. I think that's really important to make sure that you're a part of those efforts.
Absolutely. And y'all, it's now or never, right? There's been this reckoning for the past couple of years in philanthropy where a lot of folks have been pushing, and so be bold. And I think that it's for funders, for white relatives that are listening to this call, like, to really get to this change, like, you all have got to understand the benefit and the liberation that's in this for you, right? This is not just about closing the wealth gap, which that's definitely what the topic of this conversation, and it is about liberation for historically oppressed folks, but it's also about liberation for all of us from white supremacy, and those who have benefited from that also need to be free. And so that's an invitation today to everyone on this call. When we're talking about reparations, we are trying to right a wrong, but it's also an opportunity for folks who have benefited from the system to get into a right relationship and to free your spirit from the guilt and all of the shame that sometimes accompanies privilege and whiteness. So we hope that you will feel inspired by what we've heard today. I have taken my notes here from both of these professors who have just been teaching us about knowing history. That's so important. Like we are very futuristic in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. We're always thinking about solutions in the future. Everything we need to know about fixing all of that is in the past, and we cannot fix the future without understanding how we got here. We also have to be unapologetic in our commitment to racial justice and be explicit about race in the work that we're doing. We haven't reached parity in our grant making. We still only less than 10% of grant dollars go to communities of color. We must do better. That is a philanthropic injustice, I call it. But we're not doing that because we haven't been explicit and committed to racial justice in the right ways. And then we got to go beyond grant making, right? And look at models like the Bush Foundation, who are actually practicing redistribution, right? And giving those resources back in a way that respects the self-determination of Black and Brown people to use those dollars in the way they see fit for their community. And then for all of us, like, we have to ask, you know, what role have we played historically that may have caused harm in communities? And I know everybody on this call, we're all good people. We're all trying to help and save the world. And we work in nonprofits and foundations. But we have to explore, have we unintentionally caused harm? And what is the responsibility of our organization or foundation to contribute to repairing that harm? I want to invite you to Google Janaé and read the articles, the research, the policy platforms, the links that have been put in the chat here. Jen has done a lot of writing. There's a lot on the Bush Foundation website about the work that's been happening there as a beautiful case study. And of course, Decolonizing Wealth is a resource for folks who have not read the book. Please check that out. I'll invite you all to have a closing word if there's anything else you want to say before we pass it back off to our host today. Janaé, do you have to start reading it?
That was such a beautiful summary, Edgar. Thank you for that. And I'm just really happy to have been a part of this discussion. I also popped in the chat just this past June, the Movement for Black Lives put out a Reparations Now toolkit that includes, it's a really great kind of political education around reparations, including some of the case studies and terminology and activities, et cetera. So I encourage you to check that out in the chat. And just again, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I really enjoyed learning from you, Jen, and also your nuggets of gems of knowledge, Edgar. So thank you both for.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'll say last that you know, we didn't really emphasize the degree to which, you know, foundations philanthropy is of wealth gaps. I mean, there's some issues where we could say, oh, that's an issue over there that we want to have an impact on or address, and it's separate from us. But you cannot make that case around wealth gaps. Like, wealth gaps are us, right? If you are working to give away money, it means somebody has made enough money that they needed to pay people to give it away, right? We are of wealth gaps, and I think that's something we have to really reckon with as a field. But I also think it's an opportunity for moral leadership in our field that could be transformative within philanthropy, and I hope inspirational and transformative beyond. So thank you both, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Jen. All right, y'all, let's do this work. Thanks, Independent Sector, for hosting this conversation today. Appreciate everyone for listening.